Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Laurie. Just a little bit of background on today's talk. I think this was several years ago, just after our delightful Director of Development, Heidi Worth, started. And we were sitting in a meeting one time and the Flagellants came up in conversation. Heidi kind of turned to me half in jest and said, "You need to do a Flagellants 101. I said, "What, you mean I've got to come up with 101 facts about the flagellants?" And she said, "Yes, you do." So I actually did a count this morning before I came up here, and it's actually Flagellants 129. So, but it's basically kind of done in a very much in a kind of a bullet point format. So this isn't really so much of a narrative talk. It's really, I'm just going to be fact after fact after fact, not just about Carl von Marr, not just about the painting, but also the background behind the painting as well. So the talk really kind of breaks into three different sections. So we'll get started. And Carl von Marr, the artist, was born in Milwaukee on February the 14th, Valentine's Day, 1858. His parents were John and Bertha Marr. His father was an engraver sculptor, which you can see from the portrait there. The mother's portrait, Martha Bodenstein Marr, which was painted in 1891. For those of you who know your art history, will kind of think you've kind of maybe seen that painting before. It is very strongly influenced by James Abbott McNeill's famous portrait of his mother, arrangement in black and gray portrait of the artist's mother, which was painted in 1871, but Whistler's portrait of his mother was exhibited in Munich in 1888 while Carl von Marr was painting on this. And I can't imagine that Carl von Marr would have been in Munich painting and working, and a Whistler exhibition would have been mounted, and he would not have gone to see a work by his fellow American expatriate Whistler. Marr studied with Henry Vianden, and I can see a Henry Vianden right down the hallway here. Vianden was actually Milwaukee's first professional art instructor and teacher. And if you actually look at early works by Marr, when he was literally a teenager, 14, 15 years old, you can very much see the influence of Vianden in terms of subject matter and style. But Marr goes to Germany in 1875 at the age of 17, and he was actually supposed to go to Dresden because Munich was considered a breeding place for cholera and typhus, and Dresden was quieter and safer for a young man away from home for the first time. And Carl ended up studying at Weimar under Ferdinand Schuss and Karl Gerz, but first had to take, believe it or not, he had to take private lessons to bring his drawing ability up to an acceptable standard. And if any of you over the years have seen any of Carl's drawings, not only when he was a teenager, but also as a late teenager, you kind of find it hard to believe that he had to raise his game a little bit to get into art school. But it was a natural fit for Carl to go to Germany and not Paris. Marr spoke fluent German at home. His parents were immigrants from Germany. And the French capital was being seen as too full of distractions. And so you remember, 1877, the first three Impressionist exhibitions in Paris were 1874, 1876, 1877. So for an artist like Carl, who was trained with somebody like Henry Vianden with that very academic realist style, the Impressionist style with all their little brush strokes and dabs of color was completely anathema to Carl. And rumor has it that the expressions on the parents' faces there are the very same expressions that they had when Carl suggested he was going to go to Paris. I'd like to go to Paris. I don't think so. In 1876, Carl transferred to the Royal Academy in Berlin. 1877, he starts studying at the Royal Academy in Munich. And the Royal Academy had a very strong history of encouraging history painting. In 1880, he comes back to Milwaukee to start an art career. So basically, he's finished his undergrad, he comes back to Milwaukee. There's really not a lot going on here. He does some commercial work. The panorama painters aren't really in Milwaukee yet. They're not arriving until 1885, 1886. So Carl comes back and there's really not a lot going on. So he goes back to Munich in 1882. And in 1884, he actually begins sketches for the Flagellants while studying under Wilhelm von Lindenschmidt. 1884, he goes to Italy, in particular Siena, to start doing some sketching for the Flagellants. And Marr actually wanted a larger studio, as you might imagine. He was like, I've got this great idea for this painting. I need a bigger studio. Von Piloty, who was the head of the Munich Academy, basically said, no. I think he was maybe like, well, if I give you a big studio, everybody's going to be wanting a bigger studio. So Carl had to go off campus to basically get a studio big enough to paint this. So let's talk a little bit about the painting. I always call this Marr's PhD in painting. This is the painting where, he's done his undergrad, he comes back to the US, nothing happening here, he goes back to Germany, and he's got I've got to basically do something that's going to make my name and my reputation. I've got to just put my name on the map. And so this is where the kind of concept for the painting comes from. It took around 4 years to paint, 1885, and he finished it in 1889. It's inspired by Ferdinand Gregorius's History of the City of Rome painting. It measures roughly 14 feet by 24 feet. It currently has 1,606 staples holding the canvas to the stretcher. I know that because Barry Bauman, when we reinstalled this in the museum in 2013, Barry Bauman, who was probably one of the best conservators in the country, came up and he literally stapled it back onto the stretcher, essentially right where you were sitting. And I asked him, how many staples did you use? He said, 1,606. The frame is in 4 sections, 1, 2, 3, 4, with large knuckle joints at the corner. It is painted on a single piece of canvas, and it was damaged when Marr fell through it during the painting, but I'm not going to point that out till the end. There's also a small area that has not been completed, and I will show you that at the end. And there is also a ghost foot, which I will show you at the end. In 1889, it won a gold medal at the International Exhibition in Munich. In 1890, it won a gold medal in Berlin. And in 1893, it arrived in Chicago to be part of the Chicago World's Fair, along with Summer Afternoon. And while in Chicago, Marr was offered a professorship at the Munich Academy. He also received offers from Berlin and Vienna, but he decided to take the Munich job. But who else showed at the Chicago World's Fair? Short list here: Adam Emery Albright, Cecilia Bow, William Merritt Chase, Kenyon Cox, Thomas Dewey, Thomas Eakins, Frank Duveneck, Burge Harrison, Child Hassam, Winslow Homer, George Innes, Eastman Johnson, Robert Kaler, Wisconsin guy, Richard Lawrence, a couple of galleries away from here, Gary Melchers, Charles Pierce, Lila Perry, Theodore Robinson, another one with the Wisconsin connection, John Singer Sargent, Walter Sherlaw, Edmund Tarbell, Lewis Comfort Tiffany, John Henry Twachtman, Elihu Vedder, Robert Vona, Whistler, and many others whose names are lost to art history. But the Flagellants, basically, despite that, that was basically a who's who of American painting. This was the star of the show. This was the painting where after you got home, after going to see all those paintings, this was the one that they said, oh, you've got to go down and see the big painting. In 1893, it won a gold medal in Chicago. And in 1894, it was bought by a Mrs. Louise Shandine, who was a member of the Pabst family, for about $15,000 and given to the city of Milwaukee. By the mid-1970s, it was in the Milwaukee Auditorium in not great condition with a large wooden wall in front of it. Basically, it was in a banquet room. And this wall was about 9 feet high to basically stop people messing with the painting. It was in a room that was not climate controlled, the big wall in front of it. And it was actually offered to the Milwaukee Art Center, the Milwaukee Art Museum, who declined it. And it came to the West Bend Gallery of Fine Arts, who promised to clean, conserve, and house it in a new gallery. And I'm sure there's more than a few of you remember the old room that it was in at the old building. Well, that used to be an open courtyard, and it was just fortunate that that open courtyard was big enough to basically put a roof on and put this on the west wall. It's currently, this is a bit of an oxymoron, but it's currently on permanent loan to MOA from the city of Milwaukee. The West Bend Gallery of Fine Arts, as you know, already had a good collection of Carl's paintings because it was founded in 1961 by Carl's niece. That's her right down there as a young girl. And it was restored in 1975-76 by Doug Miracle of the Milwaukee Conservators of Art, and they actually installed it right there on site. It hung in West Bend from 1976 until 2008, when it traveled to Munich for the Royal Academy's 200th anniversary exhibition. As I mentioned, Carl had been a student at the Academy. 1896, they make him a professor at the Academy. And interestingly enough, in 1919, they actually made him a director of the Academy. So he had a great deal of contact in various levels with the Academy, so they made him the director. So they wanted this painting for the 200th anniversary show. It was shipped on a cardboard tube, 18 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. Basically, it was a great big piece of sonotube. The reason why the tube was 3 feet in diameter is we rolled the painting, and you actually roll a painting like this. You actually roll it painted. You know how if you're going to roll up a poster, you roll it with the image on the inside. If you're going to roll a painting like this, you actually roll it with the image on the outside, because if this is the front of the painting and this is the back of the painting, the canvas has a bit more flexibility that way than if you tried to basically kind of roll it on itself. And also a 3 foot diameter tube meant that it was on a fairly gentle curve. And you can come up close, you can actually see that you can still see a lot of texture of the canvas. So Marr didn't overload the canvas with a lot of paint, because obviously he knew that this thing obviously wasn't going to get shipped around like this. It would have to come off its stretch, it would have to get rolled. So the less paint on that canvas basically meant the canvas would be more flexible. It returned in 2000. The frame, we didn't ship the frame to Germany. The Germans were already basically at the limit of their budget to just get the painting. And then this is where you find out about overseas shipping charges. We would have had to make an entirely new crate, probably about 26 feet long, to house just the frame. And the Germans were just like, no, don't send the frame. Also, the frame is incredibly fragile. So we just sent the painting and the stretcher, and the Germans put a strip frame around it once it finally got there. As I say, it came back in 2010, basically when this building was, maybe it wasn't quite a green light, but it was kind of basically an amber light. And so we had to make the decision, do we basically put this all back together, hang it back on the wall at the old building, knowing that maybe in a couple of years this is going to have to all come back down, take it all apart, put it over here and put it all back together again. So we actually just left it rolled up for almost 3 years until we brought it over from the old building to the new building. Very much on a day like today. It was a bright, sunny day, and it was kind of like, okay, let's do this as fast as possible, because we really didn't want the painting to be outside in the cold weather as much as for as little time as we could. So we backed the truck right up to the front door of the old building. It was on its tube, on the truck over here, up the stairs, and it sat right here for about a month to acclimatize to its new home. The restretching, as I say, and reassembly was supervised by Barry Bauman from River Forest, Illinois. And the painting, as it was in the old building, it actually rests on a metal ledge. If you kind of take a look from either side, you can see that there's actually a substantial metal ledge, and then there's a couple of enormous hooks holding this. So basically the weight of the painting is on the ledge. You can't really hang a painting this large just by hooks. Eventually gravity is going to do bad things to it. So it rests on a big long metal ledge. Marr used the same model on several occasions. As I'm talking, you can see if you can find them, and I'll point some out at the end of the talk. So a little bit about Carl, a little bit about the painting. What about the subject matter? Now, the subject matter is a procession of flagellants in Siena, Italy, during the outbreak of the plague that occurred in Europe between 1347 and 1350. The setting is the Siena Cathedral, the Duomo di Siena, which is a medieval church dedicated from its earliest days as the Roman Catholic Marian Church, and now dedicated to the Assumption of Mary. The cathedral was designed and completed between 1215 and 1263 on the site of an earlier structure, and it has the form of a Latin cross with a slightly projecting transept, a dome, and a bell tower. And the dome rises from a hexagonal base with supporting columns. The dome was completed in 1264. The lantern atop the dome was added by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. The bell tower has 6 bells, where the oldest one was cast in 1149. The nave is separated by 2 aisles by semicircular arches. The exterior and interior are constructed of white and greenish black marble. You can kind of see it there, just to the right of the crucifix. Black and white are the symbolic colors of Siena, etiologically linked to black and white horses of the city's legendary founders, Senius and Ascius. So that's where the black and white coloration of the church comes from. And Marr has actually taken great liberties with the composition on this. I actually have a photograph on my notice board in my office. I mean, he makes those steps look like they're really steep and that there's about 20 steps. There's about 7 steps and they're about this steep. Also, that building that's just to the left of the black and white column there, if you were standing in real life, if you were standing here, that building would go all the way off the painting. So he basically took that building to the left and he compressed it because he wanted to put his parade of flagellants going away down in the background. So a little bit of artistic license. If a building's too large, just move the building. Take care of it that way. So the plague entered Europe via Messina in Italy in October 1347 on trading ships from the east. The plague is believed to have originated in Central Asia and spread along trading routes. And contemporary tales tell of trading ships drifting aimlessly with the crew, all dead, or arriving in port with a dead or a dying crew. Remember, wooden ships carried rats and fleas, which were the main vectors of the plague. The technical term for the plague is Pasteurella pestis, which lives in the stomach of fleas and the bloodstream of rats who act as hosts for the fleas. It was carried on the small medieval black rat called Rattus rattus, as well as brown and sewer rats. The plague was bubonic, which means it's an infection of the bloodstream from bites from the infected rats and fleas. But it was also pneumonic, spread by respiratory infection, coughing, spitting, sneezing. And this led to the belief that the plague could be spread by just looking at someone. So it's like, oh my God, he's looking at me. And it's like, no, he's probably coughing at you. And this is, believe it or not, this is actually a great painting to do with kids. Because you ask the kids, okay, if you get sick, I actually did this yesterday to give a small tour yesterday, and there's a couple of young kids in the group. And I said, okay, if you get sick, do you stay home or do you go to school? I said, well, I stay home. I said, why would you do that? He said, because I don't want to spread my germs to all my classmates and friends. And I said, you're smarter at the age of 8 than anybody was back in the middle of the 14th century, because you know how disease and is spread. Bubonic plague caused swelling or buboes in the armpits and groin. These oozed blood and pus. Boils and black blotches on the skin were caused by internal bleeding. Blood, pus, sweat, excrement, urine all smelled foul. So it was a really unpleasant thing to catch. And it was actually not called the Black Death at the time. It was called the pestilence or the Great Mortality. Common people believed it was the wrath of God for punishment for the sins of mankind. What sins were these? Greed, avarice, usury, worldliness, adultery, blasphemy, falsehood, religion, irreligion, or as the French say, plus ça change, c'est plus la même chose. More sophisticated explanations for the plague included astrology. The medical faculty at the University of Paris concluded that it was due to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius that occurred on March 20th, 1345. It's pretty specific. However, they did hedge their bets by saying that there were likely other causes that were hidden from even the most highly trained intellects. So that was their get-out clause. The triple conjunction didn't quite work out. You could go to bed healthy. You could die in your sleep. There's a tale of a French cleric who stopped overnight at a country inn in Spain while on pilgrimage. He dined with the widowed innkeeper and her 2 daughters. The next morning, the inn was strangely quiet. The widowed daughters and family servant were all dead of the plague overnight. Doctors and priests attending the sick would sometimes catch the disease and die before the patient. To die without receiving the last rites was a terrifying prospect. Pope Clement VI granted remission of sin to those who died without receiving the last rites because there was such a shortage of priests. In Cambridgeshire, England, 3 villages reported death rates of 47%, 57%, and 70%. In the Franciscan convents in Carcassonne and Marseille, 100% of inmates or residents died. And poor people died disproportionately because they stayed home. They were in the cities were crowded. Rich people fled to their places in the countryside. Peasants died, leaving crops rotting in the fields. This led to food shortages. There were no supermarkets in those days. It was very much more a hand-to-mouth existence. Wages went up as scarce workers demanded more money for their services. And more women died because they tended to stay closer to home where fleas and rats were more prevalent. The legend of the Pied Piper dates to a plague outbreak in 1284. And penitent groups formed that were authorized by the popes, and these could last for up to 3 days and attract 2,000 people. They were banned when it was discovered that they helped spread the plague. And the plague was treated in various ways. You could be bleeding, purging with laxatives or enemas, lancing the buboes, application of hot plasters, pills of powdered staghorn, potions of gold, powdered pearls of emeralds, so very expensive placebos. The patron saint of the plague was St. Roch, who had died in 1327. He had been a wealthy young man who had given his money away to hospitals, and he was returning from a pilgrimage to Rome when he encountered a diseased group. He stayed to help the sick. He caught the disease and retreated to some woods to die alone. He survived, but he appeared in public in rags, was arrested and thrown in jail as a spy. He died in jail, so that's the patron saint of the plague. And one specific group blamed for the plague were Jews. The first killings happened in Carcassonne-Narbonne in France, and Jews were blamed because they had historically been labeled Christ killers and poisoners of wells. They were also charged with the ritual murder of Christians and drinking their blood. Jews were blamed because they chose Mosaic law over the Gospels. They tended to live in ghettos or separate areas. They were easy to identify. Jews were denied civil rights that were accorded to Christians. And they were resented because they were allowed to lend money at interest. And the interest rates could be 100%, 150%. Quite a share of this interest went to the crown or the government. And if all the Jews were killed, for some people looking at that, they're like, well, there goes my debt. My debt gets wiped out. Or as one chronicler said, quote, the poison which killed the Jews was their wealth. In 1215, Pope Innocent III had decreed that Jews wear a distinctive badge, often in the form of a wheel or a circle of yellow felt. Sometimes it was green or red and white, symbolizing money, and was worn by both sexes between 12 and 14, 7 and 14, I beg your pardon. Muslims, convicted heretics, and prostitutes also had to wear the same badge. Later, some Jews had to wear pointy hats to distinguish them. And attacks on Jews began almost as soon as the plague. In Freiburg, Augsburg, Nuremberg, Munich, Königsberg, and Regensburg, all the Jews were slaughtered. At Worms in 1349, the Jewish community of 400 actually committed mass suicide rather than be killed by flagellants. Apparently, the fact that the Jews died of the plague did not prevent non-Jews from blaming them. And on July 6, 1348, Clement VI actually issued a papal bull pointing out that it can't be true that the Jews are the cause of the plague because it afflicts the Jews themselves. But obviously, rational thinking was not a strong suit of the flagellants. The flagellants movements were often called the Brotherhood of the Flagellants or the Brethren of the Cross. Men of all social groups joined flagellants. Before joining, an applicant had to make a full confession of all sins committed since the age of 7 and get permission from a spouse. And they were organized under the direction of a lay master, and I think that's the gentleman on the horse. He's the only one on the horse. And they were organized for 33 and a half days to symbolize Christ's time on earth. And they were supposed to self-support themselves to the tune of 4p a day. They could not bathe, shave, change clothes, sleep in beds, talk, or have intercourse without the master's permission. They weren't even supposed to talk to women. But some ignored these rules and were charged with having orgies that combined whipping and sex. Flagellants asserted themselves as interceders with God for all humanity, because they basically said, look, there's the church. They're not doing anything on your behalf. Seek salvation through us. Many communities welcomed them. They provided them with lodgings. Children were brought to them to be healed, or in one case, resurrected. In 1349, Strasbourg was host to a new pilgrimage every week for 6 months. And from mid-August to mid-October 1349, 5,300 flagellants reportedly passed through Tournai in what's now Belgium. Flagellant groups could number up to 1,000 people. And I think this is something you see with Marr's, the painting here. That parade goes way back off into the distance. Flagellant, they put on 3 performances or penances a day, 2 in public, 1 in private. As they came into a town, and you can just imagine this, as they came into a town, their arrival is announced by singing. They would march to the town square, which was usually located next to the church. The first part of a flagellant ceremony was a walkabout, 2 abreast, lashing themselves. Flagellant groups whipped themselves to express remorse and expiate sins. This was to emulate the scourging of Christ. Then they would fall upon the ground in a position reflective of the sin that he was most culpable of. Adulterers would lie on their stomachs, murderers on their back, perjurers on the side with 3 fingers held above their head. The flagellant master would then pass amongst them, whipping them even more. Then they would form a circle around 3 members designated as cheerleaders, and they'd be exhorted to whip harder to the side of the crowd, singing the ancient hymn of the Flagellants. Come here for penance, good and well, thus we escape from burning hell. Lucifer's a wicked wight, his prey he sets with pitch alight. And after this, as the Flagellants are lying around exhausted and bloody, people would move among them, dipping their cloths in their open wounds and stroking their faces as if to give themselves some kind of immunity. And the plague actually entered Siena in the spring of 1348. By early June, plague pits were beginning to appear, gambling was banned, money was appropriated for torce e candele, a great religious procession. The burial pits grew even larger and more numerous, and estimates of the mortality rate in Siena range between 50 to 60% out of a region with a population just under 100,000. So, that's quite stunning. Flagellant groups were common throughout continental Europe, but they never really caught on in England. The English apparently just kind of didn't do that kind of thing, Stripping naked, whipping yourself in public, it's not very English. So flagellants never kind of caught on. Some groups began to take on activities reserved for priests, such as taking confession, grant absolution, and impose penance. As I say, there was a massive shortage of priests because the priests were all going to tend to the dead and tend to the dying, catching it. So there was a great shortage of priests. Some groups went renegade, disrupting services, looting altars, ridiculing the Eucharist, and claiming to raise the dead. And something that you kind of see there, that particularly relates to this, is you kind of got that group over here. It's as if they're about to lay siege to the church, and you can just see the priest standing at the door of the church, kind of like, oh God, no, come in here, stay away, don't even think about coming. And Charles VI petitioned the Pope to suppress the flagellant groups. This appeal was actually supported by the University of Paris faculty. By December of 1349, flagellant groups were actually being suppressed. In October 1349, Clement issued a papal bull calling for their arrest and dispersal. The magistrates of Erfurt closed the city to the flagellants. Philip IV of France declared everything west of Troy a flagellant-free zone and forbade public flagellation on pain of death. Manfred of Sicily threatened to kill any member of the movement that set foot in his territory. And the University of Paris denied the flagellants' claim of divine intervention. Complete suppression did not come until about 1357. What happened after the plague? After the plague, many people continued to behave as badly as they'd done before, but it did change attitudes towards death. Your average medieval man expected to die. He expected to die by our standards very young and generally in not terribly pleasant way. On Cardinal Jean Lagrange's tomb in Avignon, the dying cardinal is depicted with hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and a visible rib cage. And the inscription upon his tomb says, "We are a spectacle to the world. Let the great and humble, by our example, see to what state they shall be inexorably reduced, whatever their condition, age, or sex. Why then, miserable person, are you puffed up with pride? Dust you are, unto dust you return, rotten corpse, morsel and meal to worms." That's the epitaph on his tomb. Prices plunged because goods outnumbered customers. Peasants took possession of things and moved into the houses of rich who had died. Priests were ordained in huge batches to fill the vacant posts. Many were barely literate. Some priests became wealthy through charging excessive fees for service. Piers Plowman William Langland said, "Parsons and parish priests complained to the bishop that their parishes were poor since the pestilence time, and asked leave and license in London to dwell and sing requiems for stipends, for silver is sweet." By mid-1350, the plague had basically run its course, and according to the medieval chronicler Froissart, a third of the world died, which would be about 20 million people. To put things in perspective, with today's global population standing at just over 7 billion, that would be 2,140,000,000 people. And if there was a benefit to the plague, it was this. In 1347, Europe was in trouble. There were too many people and really not enough resources. The Malthusian controls. This theory will not be able to keep up with the growth of the human population, resulting in disease, famine, war, and calamity. Before the plague, poverty, hunger, and malnutrition proliferated. Social mobility was difficult, innovation stifled, intellectual progress was denied as heretical. The huge death toll of the plague rebalanced things. Fewer people meant more access to more resources, farmland became used more productively, technology flourished, and it broke the Malthusian stranglehold. So there was one slight benefit to the plague at the end of it. And I just want to point out those things I told you I was going to point out. If you kind of stand right about here, you can still see where the repair was made, where Marr apparently stuck his foot through the canvas, so that would be right here. The little bit that he didn't paint, it's right here. I keep having to say that this must have been deliberate. This thing took Carl 4 years to paint. How many people came into the studio over those 4 years to kind of, hey, I'm going to go and see Carl's studio, see how that big painting's coming along. At what point, because you're kind of got this muddy gray color here, and you're looking through the spokes of the wheel. So this should be this color or this color, and it's not. And you can kind of see it a little bit there around about the kid's fist. And at what point did somebody not come into Carl's studio and say, Carl, you missed a bit, you know, you did. And he would have filled that in 5 minutes and taken care of it. And it's not as if you can say, well, it's part of this stone, because this stonework kind of goes here, not here. So it's outside the area of the white stonework. And then the other thing, the ghost foot, which was actually only pointed out to me relatively recently, is right here. Here's the foot of this flagellant here. And then there's a ghost foot here. And so it's as if he's taken his foot, instead of it being at that angle, he's moved it that angle over there as well. So apparently I looked at this painting 1,000 times, and apparently there was a kid in here on a tour who pointed it out to a docent who pointed it out to me. So there's the little ghost foot. So we got repaired tear, the ghost foot, and then the little part that he did with this. And then in terms of using the same model numerous times, I always call him Mr. Muscles. So we've got Mr. Muscles here. I think that's him up by the column on the stairs there. Look at the hair, look at the musculature of the body, and I suspect it might be him here. This gentleman here, probably shouldn't call them gentlemen because they're far from gentlemen, but that man there, if you look, not this figure here bending over, but just behind him, and then the old man to the left of the figure in red, I think he is under the two arms under the white banner there. The old man on the horse with the beard, quite possibly, there he is on the stairs holding the sack. So I'm sure there's other examples where he's used the same person. And it would make sense. I mean, if Carl is not going to get a different model for every single person that he puts into such a complex composition as this. So it's like, okay, take your shirt off and stand like this. Put your shirt off and stand like this. And you know, he's going to paint. He's going to get his value for money. If he's going to hire you as a model, he's going to get his money's worth, and he'll paint you in like 3 different positions within the painting. So there you have it. That's the flagellant.